So this is going to be a review session for state testing. It's just going to go over some basic skills that will help you for the writing portion of the English Language Arts state testing. So this is for grades 7 and 8. The skills are pretty similar. The first thing we want to make sure we're doing is understanding the structure. So when we look at a text or a passage, we need to understand how it is set up. So we need to look at the different parts of a text and how they work together. And this is probably not new information, right? You've had plenty of multiple choice questions or essay questions that ask you to look at, zoom in on multiple passages and see how they connect with each other. And that's exactly what we want to do here. So the purpose of the question, if the test asks you why an author included a specific sentence, you want to ask yourself, does this sentence introduce a new idea, provide a counter argument, or does it transition to a conclusion? So text features in informational texts, we don't want to ignore these. The author uses them for a purpose, and they're actually really helpful when you're writing your own text as well. These should be things like the sidebars, captions, and footnotes. They often contain the answer to at least one question that asks you about the text. It asks you a particular so it's going to ask you about a particular part. Those detail questions are going to be really important. And the places where we're going to look for them first is going to be in those text features. So we're going to look at those text features. We're going to look at the stanza breaks. Usually when there's a break in a stanza in poetry, it's a shift, and it's going to mark either an emotional shift or a tonal shift, a mood shift. It could even be a setting shift or speaker shift. Those are going to be the things that we want to look for so that we're able to identify what the author's doing. Because at the end of the day, the structure is telling us, what is the author doing? What do they want us to take away? When we're evaluating the argument, we want to remember that most arguments are going to be developed using facts, but that doesn't leave out opinions. So the goal here is to identify sound reasoning and relevant evidence. When you're trying to determine whether or not something is sound, you want to ask yourself, does the author's conclusion actually make sense based on the facts that have been provided? You want to watch out for generalizations. This is using one person's story to claim everyone feels that way. So a generalization could be, it's been, sunny the past few days. This week is perfect weather, but it could rain tomorrow, right? We can't make these broad general statements to come to a conclusion. We need to look at specific data and facts. So relevant versus irrelevant. 7th and 8th grade tests often ask which piece of evidence best supports the claim. I'm sure that lots of you have seen this before when you have taken either tests or you've done reading comprehension, but the trap is an answer choice might be a true fact from the story, but it doesn't actually support the specific claim in the question. So that's something that you want to make sure that you're paying attention to as well. Make sure that you're able to identify the specific claim before you go and you look for how does this support it. So also be mindful when you're reading arguments about whether there's any bias. Everyone is familiar with bias, yes? Some head noddings? Good. So remember, a bias is something that somebody goes into already kind of feeling. They've already established their opinion. So be mindful if an author has a bias. Look for loaded language, words meant to make you feel an emotion, rather than thinking about the facts that are stated. This is a distraction technique. And if you are going to be, really critical thinkers, then you want to make sure that you're dodging those distraction techniques. You're not going to let emotionally charged words distract you from the facts that are presented. So when you're navigating conflicting viewpoints, and this is often going to be something that you see on state testing as well, is two passages and they're placed closely together. The goal here is to compare how the two authors approach the same topic. So the what versus the how. Two authors might agree that global warming is a problem. That's the what. But one might focus on solutions while the other might be focusing on causes. That's going to be the how. So in order to compare conflicting viewpoints, we need to consider both the what and the how. So for example, here, point of view analysis, author A uses scientific data, which is objective, meaning factual, and then author B uses personal anecdotes. Those are going to be subjective, meaning that they're going to be a little bit more emotionally charged. They're going to include their emotions in their experiences rather than providing that data. So a strategy for answering these types of questions is to create a mini Venn diagram on your scratch paper to track what not only author A says, but what author B says and what they share and what they're different. Is everybody familiar with the Venn diagram structure? It's one of the most helpful tools when it comes to looking at multiple texts. So in case anyone is not familiar, it looks something like this. We have two circles. Please don't judge my circles. We have two circles, right? And we have author A on one side and author B on the other. And then we have what they have in common in the middle. So we're going to call that C. This is a really great writing strategy. This is good for pre-writing, your planning, and for your annotating purposes. Another thing that you have to often answer questions about on these state tests is going to be vocabulary. The goal in mastering vocabulary is knowing the Greek and Latin roots and any sort of figurative nuance that they might have. So for example, if you were to look at the word benevolence, you know that bene is good. So you would know that the word has a positive meaning. So use what you know about roots to hack those words. So if you can recognize any part of a word and you know what that part means, it's a really good way for you to make an educated guess or assumption about the meaning of that word. Is it a positive? Is it a negative? And that's kind of half the battle. So beyond similes, you also want to look for allusions. Allusions are references to mythology, history, or even the Bible, as well as irony. Irony is when you have something happening that's the opposite of what you expected, or when someone says something and it's the opposite of what they mean, kind of like sarcasm. Word choice impact. Why did the author use the word devastated instead of sad? In order to emphasize the intensity of the loss, right? The word choice impact is going to stem from the connotation of the word. Does everybody know what connotation means? Give me a quick thumbs up or thumbs down if you know connotation. I see some thumbs up. So connotation is the feeling we get when we hear a particular word, right? If I were to tell you I'm sad, you might assume that maybe I had a bad day. If I were to tell you I was devastated, then you're going to assume something more serious happened. So that's what we want to think about in the difference between the words as well as their connotation. So with your writing, your thesis is the most important part because it's meant to outline your entire essay, and it's the first thing the reader of your essay is going to see. So your first paragraph must take a clear stand. You don't want to be wishy-washy. You don't want to be somewhere in the middle. Make sure that your stance is clear and your position is clear. Use the evidence checklist. Did I use at least 2 different sources for paired passages? Did I use quotation marks correctly? Remember that when we're pulling direct quotes from a source, we have to put that in quotes. Did I explain how the quote supports my thesis? That third one is really important. Did I explain how the quote supports my thesis? This is most important because when you can explain how a quote supports what your thesis says, it shows that you've understood the passage. It shows that not only were you able to comprehend it, but you were able to apply it to your own thoughts and ideas. So it's so important that you explain how the quote supports your thesis. That is probably one of the number one tasks that scores and teachers and anybody reading an essay is looking for. Another writing strategy you want to make sure that you practice is varying your sentence structure. Avoid starting every sentence with the author says. And I can speak from personal experience with my students that I always tell them, I start to count how many times they use the author says in their essay. It becomes distracting. So we definitely want to try to make sure that we're using other phrases to introduce the text evidence. So instead of saying the author says, try according to the text, or the narrator illustrates, or this evidence suggests. Can everybody send me in the chat the way that they like to introduce evidence? If you were pulling evidence from a passage, how would you introduce it other than the author says? This evidence suggests, very good. According to the author, good. According to and the name of the text, very good. This evidence suggests, also very good. According to the text remarks, I like that one. Really great stuff, everybody. You can also say things like this highlights or this demonstrates, this illustrates, this points to, this proves. Those are all going to be really great ways for us to vary our sentence structure. So one of the essays you wrote during the mock, or one of the essays that you might see when you get to your state testing, is your narrative writing. This is the speculative essay. So we're going to review what this is asking you to do and the best ways to approach it. So on the ELA test, we're going to review the first passage. So if you did take the mock exam, the first passage was The Lost Years of Merlin and strategies for answering question 9. If you didn't take it, that's okay. We're going to go over it together, and you'll be able to use this in future situations and example testing. So for this question, you will write a narrative based on the passage. When you're given this type of essay, you want to make sure that you use characters, settings, events, and other details from the passage. So this passage is meant to be an inspiration for how you continue. You also want to make sure that you use correct grammar, spelling, and punctuation. The names, places, and other details are all in the text for you, so go back and refer to it so that you're not misspelling anything that you should know. So based on the excerpt from The Lost Years of Merlin, the question asked you to write a narrative that tells what will most likely happen to the boy next. Use what you know about the characters, setting, and events from the excerpt to write your narrative. So what does this mean? Let's break it down. A speculative essay requires you to write a story or a scenario, a brief scene, from a few details given in the test directions. When you're writing a speculative essay, a good imagination comes in handy. So this is one of the few times you actually get to be really creative, and your creativity is rewarded. So you want to be imaginative, but you want to make sure that you stay relevant. Stay in theme with what you've already read. So a speculative essay starts with a good idea to begin your story. Next, your story should focus around a conflict with a resolution. Is everybody familiar with the resolution of a story? Good, I'm seeing some head nods and thumbs up. Absolutely. So the resolution in the story is where the conflict gets resolved. So you want to make sure that when you start writing, you have a clear idea of how you intend to resolve that conflict. That's where resolution comes from. Then you will need to give enough details so your reader understands how we got from the start to the end. How did the characters manage to achieve that resolution? How were they able to manage to resolve those conflicts? Finally, you can bring your story to a logical conclusion, and always make sure to use correct grammar and spelling. That's always going to help, obviously. What will I have to write about? So you will be given a brief description of a situation. Then you're going to be asked to think about what you feel might happen as that situation develops. So based on what you know, what kind of predictions and what kind of imaginative resolution can you come up with based on the characters, the setting, and the conflict that you've already seen happening? In other words, you'll be asked to write a story from the details that you're given. For example, if you're given a situation in which a youngster has wandered too far from home, you might be asked to tell the story of the things that happen next. Possibly, you might decide to write about the youngster's challenge to find their way home. So, for example, if you were given this information, there was a young person and they were trying to find their way home, what would be the next step you would write? They realize they have to get home. What's the next thing they do? Be creative. Send me one sentence in the chat. In case you're needing some inspiration, some of the responses have been, after he wanders off, he finds himself lost in the woods. Outstanding. They explore their surroundings to figure out where they are. Oh no, he cries loudly and a stranger notices. The youngster looked around, seeming unable to recognize anything surrounding them. They start to feel a slight panic as their hands begin to tremble. I like it, very descriptive. The youngster sits down and is met by a deer who guides him home. I love it. Really good, everybody. That was good. I like the imagination that's starting to come out as well. So we can figure out how exactly this youngster plans on getting home, right? Hopefully that deer is going to be the guide archetype who brings the youngster home. So this leads us into what should I include in my story? You should write your story so your reader knows exactly what's happening and make sure that it makes sense. Molly gave me lots. I like it, Molly. Very nice. So write your story to answer the question you're being asked. In other words, don't write about an adventure in an amusement park if your question deals with a lost child trying to return home, right? So the details you come up with can be creative and they can be imaginative, but you want to make sure that they're still relevant. That's key because realistically, what this essay is looking for you to be able to show is your ability to connect ideas and create the next steps in a story. Catch your reader's attention in the opening paragraph by using a compositional risk. So make sure that the risk sets the tones that you wish to set. So for example, avoid using a startling moment for a story with a comforting mood. Again, we want to make sure that we're cohesive, meaning that everything we're including falls together. It goes together. It makes sense together because we want it to be logical. Additionally, you want to make sure that you're using higher level academic vocabulary that uses words like microscopic instead of tiny or distraught instead of sad. And you started doing that with the examples that you gave as well. A question students often ask when they're approaching these types of passages that they need to write is, should I pre-write before I begin? And the answer is pretty much always a yes. You should always pre-write before you begin writing. When you pre-write, you organize your thoughts, you create a plan for writing, and the pre-writing process warms up your brain so that it can prepare you for a good rest of your writing session. So pre-writing is essential when you're writing any type of essay because like we just said, it's going to be a place where you can organize. That organization can later be a checklist for you. Did I include everything I'm supposed to include? An outline or a graphic organizer or a concept map? Those are places where you can check off and say, that's what included. I made sure to do this. My characters are in there. The setting is established. And those are all going to be things that you want to make sure that you're including and meeting for that criteria. For your speculative essay, you're going to use your imagination to speculate. Speculate means describe what might happen in a certain situation. So you're going to use things like deductive reasoning as well as context clues to come up with the next steps. You will not be arguing your point. Instead, you will be addressing the main question. What do you think is happening? So there's no argument here. And again, this is a place where you get to be creative. So take advantage of that creativity opportunity and make sure that you're referring to all of the specific details that you have and then use them to work for you. Next up is the literary analysis review. I'm sure that everyone in here, grade 7 through 8, has written a literary analysis essay. So we're going to go over that as well as different tips and tricks for how to make sure you write a really great literary analysis. On the ELA test, we're going to review the last 2 passages and strategies for answering question 14. For this passage, you will write an essay based on the passages that are provided. Typically, you'll get 2. Write your essay in the space provided on the next page. Your writing should include present and develop a central idea. Present and develop a central idea. Provide evidence and/or details from the passages. Use correct grammar, spelling, and punctuation. So your task is going to say something along the lines like, write an essay that explains how the article and the poem portray the blizzards of 1888. Use evidence from the article and the poem to develop your essay. Let's unpack the tasks that you have to include, those 3 bullet points. So you have to present and develop a central idea. The central idea is going to be the main idea of your 2 passages. You have the article and the poem. The prompt even gives you the central idea. How do they portray the blizzards of 1888? So that's something we can use as a checklist. We're already in tune to what we have to be writing about, and therefore that gives us our next step, which is provide evidence and/or details from the passage. So this is where we go back and we look at how it's describing, right? Details mean describe. So that's what we want to make sure that we're using to develop our own writing. And then obviously correct grammar and spelling, punctuation, refer back to the text for any particular words that you need to include and make sure that we're spelling them correctly. Does anyone have any questions about these types of prompts? I'm going to assume that means no. So, literature and informational texts. On the literary analysis section of the state test, you'll be asked to read fiction and nonfiction texts and write analytical essays in response. Is everyone familiar with what a fiction versus a nonfiction text is? Very good. So a common prompt is to analyze a certain theme that is covered in the passages. Most likely the theme is going to be covered differently in the passage, but the theme itself will be similar. So if we were looking at the article that describes the snow or the blizzards and the poem, one is going to probably be pretty factual, and the other one is probably going to have a lot of figurative language like similes, personifications, hyperboles, etc. And that's going to be emotionally charged language. It's going to have a strong tone and a strong mood, where an article is typically going to be unbiased. It's going to be objective information, factual. So they're still focusing on the same idea, but they're doing so in two different ways. So what we would do in this task is compare how they're telling us about those blizzards. So when you're writing analytical essays, you'll likely be asked to compare the way each author developed the theme, finding both similarities and differences. For example, compare the way a theme is used in a classical piece of literature and in a more modern piece of literature. So you should address the structure of the piece. A poem, for example, is written in stanzas, while a piece of informational text is written in language that does not necessarily rely on those literary devices such as metaphor, simile, alliteration, onomatopoeias, etc. You should also acknowledge the author's purpose for the piece. That's just as important. While an informational piece may be written to instruct or share knowledge, a literary piece may be written to teach a lesson or to resolve a conflict. So what I would like everyone to do right now is write one sentence that's factual and one sentence that's emotional, but it should be about the same topic. And since we have snow and blizzards of 1888 on the mind, I'd like you to pick your favorite kind of weather. Describe it factually and then describe it emotionally and see how the writing changes. 2 sentences. All right, so a lot of us did pretty fantastic with giving examples of factual descriptions of weather and then emotionally charged descriptions of weather. We had snow being compared to blankets. We had rain being cozy. We had the physical, actual definition of what snow is, which was outstanding. So there's a clear difference between when we state something factual or when we state something emotional, and it gives a different perspective, right? So for those of you who use snow, and for those of you who used it and gave me that emotional description, you almost made me like it. I almost agreed with you, but I still want sunny and 75. But you did a great job with your emotions. And that's the key. We want to have some sort of emotional reaction when we're writing emotionally, right? Whereas factually, we want to get rid of those emotions. So organizing informational texts. We're going to discuss the ways informational texts are organized. This information is critical, and we brought it up briefly in the very beginning of our review session today. But on the state test, you'll be asked questions about the structural patterns and of selected informational texts. So you're going to be asked to look at things like text features, such as headings, definitions, footnotes. You'll also be able to look at various paragraphs and think about how they connect to one another, how they can be compared, how they can be contrasted, and how they work together for the overall main idea of that non-fictional text. So the first way that an informational text can be arranged is through chronological order. A chronological text arranges facts according to the time at which they had occurred. So for example, a social studies text is probably going to list the battles as they occurred throughout the Revolutionary War. So they're going to start with the first and end with the last. You may see a timeline or a chart that lists the most important events in order in which they took place. So for example, the Battle of Lexington and Concord is considered by many to be the first major battle of the Revolutionary War. Since it occurred in April 1775, it is listed before the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was fought in June 1775, so chronologically. When dealing with chronological order, common transitional phrases include first of all, secondly, next, then, later, and finally, along with any qualifying dates and times of the year. So those transition words are going to be clues that you can look for in a text to determine whether or not it is a chronological structure. Transition words are always going to be a text feature that authors are using to organize their information. And if your goal or your strategy is to determine how their information is organized, then we definitely want to make sure we zoom in and pay close attention to those transitional phrases, just as important as you using them in your own writing. The next way that a text might be organized is through problem solution. Think of the beginning of a math textbook chapter. Often, your text will introduce a problem that includes the concept that is being taught. A step-by-step explanation will be shown that leads to the solution of the problem. For an argumentative essay, the problem being addressed is explored and then a solution is presented, along with a counter to the opposing side's strongest argument. Everyone's familiar with a counter argument, yes? Perfect. Great. So for problem solution pieces, chronological order is important for each step. So this is a unique one in that it's combining two different strategies. In order for us to solve the problem, we need to be able to convey the steps in which we need to take for that solution to occur. So if we go out of order, it might mess up the solution. So this is a time when chronological order is going to be implemented in the problem solution. However, you have to identify the problem first, and then you'd be able to explain the solution. Common transitional phrases, besides those that we've already discussed, include numbering steps. So step 1, step 2. You can also use transitional words and phrases like therefore, as a result, nonetheless, also, furthermore, moreover, and in conclusion. So therefore, as a result, and nonetheless are going to signal that we're providing the next steps of these solutions or the results of what happens. Furthermore, moreover, and in conclusion is showing us the process as we go through the solution. Next up, we have cause and effect. In a cause and effect essay, a writer is trying to prove that a certain cause had led directly to a resultant effect. In other words, the stated result has occurred because of conditions A, B, C, and D. So we're familiar with the process of something happening and then other things happening as a result of it. An essay about world events will explain causes that led up to a major event taking place. This event is the effect of the causes. So things occurred which led to the effect. This is the result. For example, an environmental science paper may focus on the causes of pollution in a community. Some of these may be a result of poor waste disposal methods, a lack of comprehensive recycling programs, excessive highway noise, and the excessive use of woodlands for commercial building projects. The effect is a harsh, negative impact on the local environment. This will probably result in imbalances and even toxicity in the land, water, and air. There may also be a negative impact on the plant and animal life, as well as the people living in the area. So notice in this example, we have the effects, which I will highlight. We have poor waste disposal methods, a lack of comprehensive recycling, excessive highway noise, and excessive use of woodlands for commercial building projects. So those are the things that are occurring. And then what comes after is going to be the effects. So we have imbalances and toxicity in the land, water, and air, and negative impact on plant and animal life, as well as people. So first, we're able to identify what's happening, and then we're able to identify what's the result of that happening. A key to writing a successful cause and effect piece is using textual evidence to support your point of view. Referencing the text, it should always be a goal for you. Always refer back to it. And I always tell my students, make that text work for you. You should pull direct quotes rather than indirect or summary because of the fact that it should be statistical and factual, objective information in a cause and effect essay. For cause and effect pieces, common transitional phrases are going to include since, because of the fact, for that reason, provided that, thus, and for this reason. These phrases all signal that we've established a cause for the effects or results that have unfolded. Does that make sense to everybody? Great. So I want you to think about a cause and effect for an emotion. You pick the emotion and tell me how we got there. I'll go first. Tired is my emotion or state of being, and it's Friday. It's been a long week. That's the cause. So you're thinking of an emotion and you're telling me how we got there. Cause and effect. All right, my friends, good examples of those cause and effects. Next up is the old tried and true, the compare and contrast. This one you have been doing for time and time again, I'm sure. So to create a compare and contrast essay, you have to focus on similarities and differences. Samantha, you're making me laugh. It's very strong, yes. So we're looking at similarities and differences between two or more topics. So imagine you're comparing the writing styles of Ray Bradbury and John Steinbeck, two very prominent authors. You would compare the two by illustrating the passion that each had for the topics that they were addressing. Bradbury and Steinbeck both showed the ways that people can sometimes be a bit harsh. Both Bradbury and Steinbeck wrote of characters who were the victims of unthinkable and at times harsh societies. However, Bradbury's prose has a definite poetry in its descriptiveness, although sometimes it can become excessive. On the other hand, Steinbeck used a more economical and less flowery style to describe his characters and senses. So here's an example of zooming in on the purposes of both authors, what they typically wrote about, but how they told different stories with their writing styles. So for comparison pieces, you're going to use transitional phrases such as despite, nevertheless, nonetheless, on the other hand, similarly, in contrast, or in similar fashion. So these transitional phrases are going to signal that you're talking about a similarity or a difference between the two topics that you are going to be writing about. Next up, we have description. When you're writing an essay using description, your major task is to paint a clear word picture. Your goal is to describe in such a way that readers with little experience in that area can still understand your point clearly. I'm sure that a lot of you have probably heard the phrase show, don't tell. Yes? Yes, that has been told to us since elementary school. So when you're showing and not telling, you're using great detail, and that detail is going to appeal to the senses. It's also going to refer to spatial as well as other components that can create this physical presence of whatever it is you're writing. So for example, you're writing a descriptive essay on the general rules of baseball. You decide that including the major areas of the game, pitching, hitting, fielding, throwing, base running, and strategy is too daunting of a task. So instead, you concentrate on hitting. You must consider the selection of a bat, the grip of the bat, the stance, the swing, and the strategy. To do so effectively, you decide to take each area and explain it in detail so even someone who is not familiar with baseball can understand your points. For these description pieces, you're going to use common transitional phrases like in front of, behind, next to, across, over, or even on top of. So that's where the spatial comes in, but you still want to make sure you're describing. For example, you're going to physically describe where you're placing your hands on the bat, but you're also probably going to describe what's going on around you outside. So with that being said, we have a step-by-step guide for how you can manage your 90 minutes for one essay. Typically on the ELA sections of these exams, you're going to have 90 minutes or an hour and a half to compose your essay. We want to spend the first 5 minutes reading the instructions. Then we take those instructions and we unpack. I want you to think task. What's my task? Who's my audience? And what's my purpose? So if we think back to the different examples of essays that we've covered today, you might be describing, you might be comparing and contrasting, you might be identifying a problem and proposing a solution, you might be comparing and contrasting. So think about the different examples we did today in the chat as well. I know they were really quick and informal ways of getting our brains working, but you still were able to identify the purpose of them and you were able to accomplish that purpose. You were able to complete that task. And you were able to also consider that I, the teacher, am your audience. So that's important as well. Things that you were giving to me, you might not have said if you were talking to someone else. So unpack task, audience, purpose. The next 10 minutes should be going back to the text and finding your details. This is going to be the text evidence. So remember, we want to use direct quotes. We don't want to do too much paraphrasing or summarizing. Direct quotes are going to show that you're able to engage with the text, not only because of the fact that you understood it, but now you can apply it to your own ideas. After you've found your evidence, spend the next 5 minutes organizing those details. Where is this piece of text going to fit in my essay? This is part of that pre-writing process that we talked about. Whether you're making an outline or a concept map or creating a checklist for yourself, think about what part of the text you're going to use and where it fits in your essay. You don't have to rewrite the whole passage. You can just say paragraph 3 goes in body paragraph 1, and information from body paragraph or from paragraph 4 is going in body paragraph 2. So you just want to spend 5 minutes deciding where that text evidence is going to fit best and be most effective in conveying your main idea. Then you want to spend about 25 to 35 minutes drafting. This is where you spend your time conducting your sentences for each of your paragraphs. And our recommended sentence length for each paragraph is also listed on the screen here. Paragraph 1 should be 5 to 7 sentences. This is where you're going to hook your reader, provide your background information, and establish your thesis or main idea. Paragraph 2 is going to be body paragraph 1, 6 to 8 sentences. This is where you're giving that topic sentence, you're including the text evidence, and then you're commenting and explaining that text evidence. This is going to be repeated through paragraphs 2 through 4. All of those are going to be about 6 to 8 sentences. Again, topic sentence, conveying your ideas, using text evidence, and explaining your text evidence. And then finally, paragraph 5 is going to be about 5 to 7 sentences. This is where you're going to conclude your essay. You're wrapping up the points, you're restating your thesis, and you're leaving your reader with a lasting impression. Now that they've read your essay, what should they do with this information? How does it relate to them? Then you want to spend the next 7 to 10 minutes revising for the first read. This is going through and making sure the information you've included is relevant, it's cohesive, meaning it connects, and that you've directly answered the prompt being asked. Then we go through and revise a second time. This is going to be looking and making sure that we've included all of the components that are required. We've answered all parts of the prompt. And then the last 5 to 10 minutes are going to be spent editing and proofreading. This is where we're thinking about grammar, mechanics, sentence structure. Are they varied? Are they using a variety of words? And proofreading. Did I punctuate properly? And did I spell everything correctly? Does anyone have any questions about anything we've covered today? What is your favorite type of essay to write before we conclude? Favorite type of essay to write? We have descriptive, compare and contrast. Ooh, argumentative. Hi, Tony. Argumentative, descriptive, literary analysis, compare and contrast, analysis, narratives, expository or argumentative, outstanding, narrative, very nice. All right, everyone. Well, that's all we have today. I hope that you found this to be helpful. These tips and tricks are not just for state testing, but they can be applied whenever you're doing any sort of writing for any of your classes, not even just English class. You can do it for any class. It was so great having you. I really appreciate everybody's participation, and I hope to see you soon.